in the church, um, one of the things that I think many followers of Jesus have limited understanding of is this isn't only those who have not been raised in Christians' homes or who have not been Christians. There are people sitting in services every Sunday morning where this trauma is under the surface, and they don't feel like even the church has a place that they can safely deal with this post-abortion impact on their soul. What happens after an abortion? I'm Dr. Carol, and thank you for joining me on this episode. The whole abortion arena and conversations around that have again reached the top of public discourse. Very loud conversations about this, especially with the overturning a couple months ago of Roe versus Wade here in the United States. But for the many individuals who have been affected by this part of life, those women who have had an abortion, those whose someone in their family has had an abortion, those men who their wife or girlfriend has had an abortion or dealing with those decisions, the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade does not stop what's going on in their soul. Today we are talking about the after effects. What happens in a person's soul after losing a pregnancy, especially when the choice is made to be involved in doing that. You'll hear in this conversation today about how it is not just a cut and dry, I don't want this baby. There's always other factors involved, always so many other factors involved. And what happens in a person's interior world after that kind of an experience? Dr. Theresa Burke is the founder of Rachel's Vineyard, the largest post-abortion ministry in the world. Her healing programs have a very unique way of bringing wholeness to people who have been through trauma. Rachel's Vineyard specifically focuses on men and women who have been affected by abortion, either their own or an abortion in someone they care about or know. Dr. Theresa has been involved in counseling. This program, Rachel's Vineyard, has been in place for almost 30 years, started in 1993, and is currently happening in 49 states, 49 out of the 50 states, and in over 70 countries around the world. It has been translated into many languages. I want Dr. Burke to explain more about this whole very deep heart matters. Dr. Theresa Burke. Well, Dr. Theresa Burke, first, thank you for being with us. It is a real honor to have you on the program today.
Oh, it's for me too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. This is a topic that is, again, hot in culture. It has been, but it is once again, since here in the United States, Roe v. Wade is no longer the law. We're talking about abortion and particularly post-abortion, what people experience after and what Jesus wants to do. I'd just like to know first how this area became important to you. What got you into post-abortion ministry?
That's kind of a big question. I can tell you that I was in school for counseling. And one of my first internships was to lead a support group for women with eating disorders.
Yes.
It wasn't an internship, it was like a field placement. So it's the first time you're going into a situation to use some of the skills you've acquired. I think it happens like your junior year. But anyway, so I was facilitating the support group for women with anorexia and bulimia, eating disorders. And there was also a special physicians group for impaired physicians who had eating disorders. So there were those two groups. And the subject of abortion came up one night that a woman that was having nightmares and flashbacks to her abortion experience. And she said these memories and images are bad enough of a struggle. And she said, but that her ex-husband kept calling and leaving messages on her answering machine where he referred to her as a murderer. And he knew like the emotional triggers that could drive her to complete despair. And he used them frequently because he would do this. And this is before cell phones. So her 3 children would often hear the incoming messages that come on your machine that everyone in the house hears. So this was so distressful. And what happened after that is that she actually slit her wrists with a razor blade and ended up in the psych hospital. And she had just been released. Her arms were bandaged, and she was telling the story about what had happened. Well, everyone's listening intently. And then one of the girls says, "Your husband's a horrible man." And everybody nodded their heads. She said, "I had an abortion too, and it would just kill me if somebody kept reminding me about it." And then another lady got up and she started cursing and swearing. And she said, "We have a right to control our bodies." And she cursed out anybody that should try to make her feel guilty about abortion. She said, "Having an abortion is the best thing I ever did. And, screw anybody that wants to have
Yeah.
me feel guilty."
Yeah.
So then there was another lady that actually ran out of the room, slammed the door behind her, and we could hear her car screeching out of the parking lot. Now, remind you, I'm just a student. I'm in my first experience of a clinical setting, trying to manage a group. And the only group I had ever managed before that was a youth group, because I was a youth minister. So it was just like a bomb going off, and you knew I'd be a great therapist someday because I showed so much insight. I called that girl that left later that night and I said, "Are you okay? You seemed upset." That was my insight, like, duh.
Yeah.
And she said, "I wish we could focus on eating disorders and stop talking about abortion." And I said, "Did you have one too?" She said, "It was a long time ago and I don't want to talk about it." So here we have this microcosm of the bigger world that is still true today.
Yes.
You have people indicating survivor modes of trauma. We have the fight or flight. That woman that started cursing and swearing, she inhibited any meaningful discussion we might have had about people's feelings. We have the avoidance flee response of the girl that left and could not tolerate the word abortion. And we see this even in churches. People, if they hear a sermon, they sit in the back of the church and they're going to flee out the door.
Yep.
So that's the avoidant flight response. And then we have the girl in active symptoms of PTSD who is telling about her story, and it's creating this arousal in everybody else that can't really deal with the topic. The worst part of all this experience is that I'm still a student and I have to go to my supervisor who's a psychiatrist, and he when you're a student, you have to like take process notes of everything that happened and regurgitate it to your supervisor. And so I did that, and he leaned in at me and he said, "You have no business." He pointed his finger at me. "You have no business prying into people's abortions. Having an abortion is a private, personal thing." And I was instructed not to bring it up in the group. I was appalled. I just thought, here I'm told that this is treated by the talking cure, and that it's not about what you're eating, it's about what's eating you, which is why just about every subject under the sun was allowed in these groups. We talked about everything. And yet here's this taboo issue that my supervisor is getting really angry about it. And I said to him, that he said that she was having a psychotic reaction caused by her medication. And I thought, oh my gosh, if it is an adverse event, get her off the medication, psychiatrist, And, and I said, "I think she has post-traumatic stress disorder, the flashbacks, the nightmares." That's when he said that's a psychotic reaction. So I was so discouraged and I left that group, and I started the first therapeutic support group for healing after abortion. Our groups were always full. They were free. They were just like, I had no idea what I was doing, honestly. I just knew that women needed a place, a safe place where their grief could be explored and expressed, because too often abortion is carried in secret. Nobody knows. women are not inclined to speak about it. There's a lot of shame attached to it, and it leads to what we call a disenfranchised grief, which means they're not able to access it. It's not socially supported. There's no Hallmark cards. You don't have a
Yeah.
funeral. There's no processing or integrating that experience. And then that experience gets sort of like sequestered off into a phantom quarantine memory. And it's in this ball, this is what my life's work has really been about with many traumas, is the traumatic reenactment that comes out of that because it hasn't been processed or integrated or even sometimes categorized in the past. And this is a really interesting thing since Roe versus Wade has been overturned. I think that what was sanctioned as legitimate medical health care is now being questioned. And so the consciences of many people have been opened of what they've kept down and suppressed. So we have full retreats throughout the United States and parts of the world right now. After COVID, there was a dip, shutdown, we all got back into business. But this has really, it's an opportunity for grace and an opportunity for healing to go back and re-examine. And we know that women are having a trauma response to the news. We can see it in the rage and the anger. So you kind of think, how do we promote healing in a context of rage and fury? And all these activist groups that are actually praying to keep people in this fight mode of trauma. And we know that anger is a stage of grief. So it's that unprocessed grief. And the interesting thing is that they don't feel safe. So when they're attacking crisis pregnancy centers, these groups are saying, if we're not safe, you're not safe. And they're attacking the very places that are trying to give support to mothers.
Yes.
Free ultrasounds, free baby care, homes, living situations if you need them, to be able to be supported through that so that they're not alone. And they don't see their baby as not being safe. They see their body as not being safe. And this is where I'd like to, I'm probably talking too much. Am I talking too much? Do you have a question?
Oh, no, Dr. Burke, this is just wonderful. I will just insert one thing. By profession, I'm an OBGYN physician. I remember I was covering for another physician at this particular time a few years ago, and a patient came in for her first prenatal visit, and everything was medically, checked out okay, but I could tell that something was wrong, and we just got talking, and in asking about her pregnancy history, came out she had had 4 previous abortions, and she was scared to death that God would not allow her to have this baby, thinking he would punish her by taking this child because of her previous abortions. I will never forget that.
Well, I think I've seen that 1,000 times over.
Yes.
This idea that God is going to punish you, that he'll take it out on the child. And the other thing I wanted to say is this idea of not having control of your body. We've done studies on the people that are coming into Rachel's Vineyard, and we learned that 65% of them had histories of sexual abuse. And this is in keeping with the statistics that don't, all these women that don't report all that. But I began to write and see abortion itself as a traumatic reenactment of sexual abuse.
Wow.
And I don't think that feminists of this day see or understand that link at all. And so instead of addressing the abuse of women, we scapegoat the innocent child that's a part of her, causing victim then to become perpetrator. And this is in the triangles of abuse. This is such a painful thing. And that's why I made the Grief to Grace program for healing of abuse. And we deal with all kinds of abuse in there: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, even and sexual, even like all forms. But it was sort of like the next step for people who needed to do that deeper work after they had healed their role in abortion. There was like this thing for everything that drove that response in terms of not having control of your body, right? And I'm sure as an OBGYN, you're going to see, and it's been my experience, that the symptoms of sexual abuse, that hyperarousal, that fear, that can't get over on the table and spread your legs in an OBGYN office, or the flee response that I've written about many times, where someone's there for an exam and they might have to avoid an OBGYN because they don't want to feel or remember that traumatic experience. So they'll jump off the table in the middle of exam, hyperventilating, like as if I have to get out of here. and that's the flee response again, of so overwhelmed that you just got to get up and run out. And a lot of people say that's where they were frozen in their traumas, that they couldn't get up and run because the stress had actually paralyzed them, and they lay there helpless when everything inside their mind was screaming, get out of here.
Yeah.
So we know that there's huge amounts of ambivalence and attachment sometimes to the baby, and tremendous amounts of coercion, where women are forced to do the best thing, by boyfriends, by husbands, by the man who sits there to be progressively supportive, like,
Yep.
I'll do whatever you choose. And in her mind, she hears, I'm not going to be there to support you,
Yep.
because he's saying, go do whatever you want. I'm uninvolved in this.
Yeah. In the church, one of the things that I think many followers of Jesus have limited understanding of is this isn't only those who have not been raised in Christians' homes or who have not, been Christians. There are people sitting in services every Sunday morning where this trauma is under the surface, and they don't feel like even the church has a place that they can safely deal with this post-abortion impact on their soul.
You're so right about that. And, a lot of people used to say that, it's religion imposing your values on people, that it's, you're making them feel guilty because of your theology. But we know, because Rachel's Vineyard has spread to 80 some countries, it's in 37 languages all over the world, where it's not a political issue, where it's, and even in other religions, we've had many religions come to our program as well, because it's very powerful exercises to release grief and to have an experience of a living God who is full of mercy, tenderness, who wants to heal his people. I know that this is true because I've seen the dramatic transformation in people when they experience a loving God that they don't know, like the woman that you spoke of, who is just sure that God's out to get her, to punish her, to make her pay, and that's just not what God wants. And we know that, I have 5 kids and a pretty busy life. I never planned to spread anything all over the world. I just,
Right.
this was not, and I never made a business plan. And we just worked for years as a volunteer till it was like taking over my life. So I know that God wants to heal people. We have a staff of 2 people here.
Oh,
And so this is what God has done, because those who've been healed have been those who have started up the programs, done the translations, taken it to other countries. We estimate there's over 500,000 volunteers involved, most of them post-aborted men and women, in the work of Rachel's Vineyard.
thank you
So
for saying men and women, and maybe that's something we should just highlight. Many people may also assume that the woman who had the abortion is the one who has the impact, but it also affects men. Talk about that for a second.
well, sure it does, because abortion happens in a relational context. It's not a carefully made decision between a woman and her healthcare provider and her God. Like,
Yes.
it's not that at all. It happens with a man. And while we might want to scream at deadbeat dads, they have absolutely no rights in a court to protect and defend or save the life of their child. So we have a couple categories of men here. They're all grieving. But there's men who did not want the abortion and they had no legal leg to stand on, devastated by the abortion, and in effect, if I can use this word, made impotent, castrated, as it were, in complete powerlessness. They grieve deeply. They suffer from great depression. There's other men who might have forced it, and then they're living with all the results of it, and the grieving itself the grieving of their woman triggers anger and rage, because they don't want to be reminded of their role in pressuring her. Many of these relationships don't last.
Right.
They're like a very high percentages. I've seen some studies in the 90%. So what was done to save a relationship ends up destroying it. And then where do the symptoms come? The symptoms come in bed, because that's that act of sex was responsible for introducing a very traumatic experience of death. And I can also tell you, I know many women who would rather be lesbian than ever have to be in a position where they would be in that, where they would have to, destroy the life of another child that's theirs.
Wow.
So
that is powerful, Dr. Burke. That because that pregnancy began in relationship, the woman or the man traumatized by ending that life that the relationship began, their forever ability to bond again in relationship is impacted. That reminds me of another friend of mine who had 3 abortions in her teen years. And when she finally got married, was not able to bond emotionally with her husband or feel sexual pleasure with him. I never quite put that together in just the way that you described it.
Well, it leads to a lot of sexual dysfunctions, actually,
Yes.
including some of the worst,
Yes.
dysphoria, and like where they can't even have. And, this is, I would be going on a tangent if I was to tell this story, but in violent, like, Lorena Bobbitt,
Yes.
when she sliced off her husband's reproductive organ with a butcher knife, in case some of your audience wasn't around when that happened. I think we remember it because we're older, but she became the poster victory child for victory, as in snip, snip. And I think she was capped for empowerment of women. And I think that she tapped into a collective rage against men that many women have because of this experience. And I will tell you, one of the reasons that I even wanted to include men was because so many women hate men. Mm-hmm. And they were triggered by men, even when we had our early days, and even today. If a man's in that group, I thought this was a woman's thing. Why are men here? And they hate men, but God uses the men and the tears of that man and the grief of that man to heal the entire group.
Wow.
And
wow.
This is, we also, in Rachel's Vineyard, we have grandparents of aborted children who are invited to come and grieve. Wow. We have the spouses. We recommend that you come with the partner of your current relationship. So you wouldn't go back and heal with an old boyfriend, but you would bring your husband, and your husband is invited to spiritually adopt that aborted child.
Wow.
So we have the men claiming paternity, as it were, because if that child had lived, the child would have been loved by that spouse. So it's a way to like bring healing in the family. And we also, the grandparents can come. We've also have abortion providers who come, those involved as ultrasound technicians. We've had abortionists come. And it's so powerful because reconciliation really happens, even in some of the ways that we facilitate a dynamic like that, because he thought he was helping her fix the problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet he becomes a trigger later where women are afraid to go to a doctor, or they will travel 40 miles out of their way just to not have to pass the clinic where they had it. Yeah. And these are more avoidant responses. So we just see signs of the trauma all around, and siblings of aborted children. If your mom had 4 abortions, that's 4 brothers and sisters you don't have. And many people find out about that. They find out when they're young. And we've worked with many people who had a sense of it. And I'm not sure all the reasons why, but there is definitely an abortion survivor syndrome, which is very similar to the existential, guilt that grew out of the Holocaust. Yes. It's very similar, where you exist with abortion, you exist because somebody wanted you. But what if you were to become unwanted? And none of us should be like, what if you become unwanted? You have to stay perfect to keep yourself, and then at some point, that burden of perfection, staying wanted, at some point people turn away from and they go hog wild, like rebellious, because they just don't have a sense of security and even attachment in a relationship when they're aware that another sibling had lost its life. And this is a very great loss for people, because you just think of your family, your brothers and sisters, even dealing with an aging parent as an only child, you know, for people that are out there.
Yeah.
Like, it's such a burden. There's nobody to share the responsibility with, the care with, the, you know, and there's just so much expectation placed on that child, especially if it's an atonement baby, to make up for that which was lost.
Oh,
And
wow. Yeah.
and
You alluded to something that I think is important, and that is all the symptoms that these women and men can experience. And some people who just want to ignore it, hide it, like in your initial story in that eating disorders group. Some people, I don't want to talk about it. Do you think most people out there, when they are wrestling with the decision to have an abortion, are even aware of this? I doubt that any woman wakes up one day. There may be, I don't know all women in the world, but I doubt a woman wakes up one day and says, I decide today, I think I'm going to kill my baby. That's what I'm going to do today. There's always, you know, the whole person pressure that is brought to bear, her past life, her relationships. But do people even think about what can happen after and what the impact on their soul is? I don't think most people do.
I think that some people struggle, and there's signs that can tell right away. Like if you have any attachment to the baby, if there's any coercion involved,
Yeah.
these would be risk factors that are well known and documented. Any history of mental illness, to go through a traumatic experience like abortion is only going to increase. There's not a shred of evidence saying that it increases women's mental health and well-being, especially over the long term, because we see initially a lot of the data shows that there's a sense of relief because the crisis is over, it's done. So the symptoms emerge later, as in post-traumatic stress disorder, after the event, when you're struggling, when you're holding your wanted baby for the first time, when you see the ultrasound for the first time, instead of being this glorious, empowering, like wonderful, miraculous moment that should be filled with joy and excitement, it's like, oh my gosh, there's really a baby there at 12 weeks, you know? And then they go into this horrible, this is the triggering moment, the open sesame of all the regret and loss, and they can have trouble bonding with the baby. In fact, when I started my, when I was working later in graduate school, I wanted to do a research project of the bonding, the letdown reflex of nursing mothers.
Yes.
That was my study, because I had a lot of clients now that I'm doing these support groups. I had a lot of clients who had postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, and they were linking that because they gave birth to the baby and the baby becomes a trigger. So instead of bonding, they're so uptight, their milk isn't flowing, the letdown reflex isn't happening. And they would, even with the postpartum psychosis, they would hear voices saying, you know, you destroyed 2 other babies. Why not throw this one out the window? So painful, like so painful, like this beautiful moment of mother and child time of bonding. You're having all the unresolved grief surfacing in such a powerful way. And all these kinds of, and they don't even have to be postpartum psychosis. People can ruminate on these kinds of thoughts and they say, I would never do this. Why am I thinking of this?
Mm-hmm.
In my clinical things, I give case after case. I even take books that are writing about it where, you know, someone that had 4 abortions is having thoughts of infanticide on a regular basis.
Wow.
You know, so this is not normal, but that book was extolled as providing myth-shattering insights that will affirm women's sanity. Why? Because so many women are thinking like this. Why? Because so many women have unresolved grief after pregnancy loss.
Wow. You've mentioned Rachel's Vineyard several times, and I would like you to just take a couple minutes and describe specifically what is the Rachel's Vineyard experience like for someone who is experiencing this grief after a pregnancy loss.
Okay, well, there's many good programs for post-abortion healing. There's many Bible studies. This is completely different because I use something that's called living scripture exercises, which I created. And my background before I went into psychology was actually theater. So over the years, I can finally explain why it works based on all the latest neuroscience. But what we do is we have many props and many exercises to facilitate grief work. So what it means is that you don't need words. We're engaging in spiritual exercises, meditation. So we're able to go into the story of the trauma and then calm and soothe ourselves in a meditation. There's gentle music, there's soft lighting, there's candles. And then we have many exercises of pouring water. And I'll give you an example of some to make it a
Sure,
little concrete.
sure.
Like one of the first ones that we have is blind Bartimaeus. So we read the scripture, then all the lights are turned down, everyone closes their eyes, and you go through a meditation where you are the blind man. You've heard about all these miracles, you've heard about what Jesus is doing, and yet you're just on the side of the road, and but you're kind of excited that maybe you would get a chance to meet. And then when a facilitator would come and say, you know, Mary, take courage, he's calling you. And then she's invited to say, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. And then the pastor on the retreat would put his hands on her head and say, what do you want me to do for you? And then they answer out loud. So in the darkness, with only one candle that represents the light of Christ, we are speaking with the divine physician. Whether people have faith or not, there is no preaching, there is no teaching. It's an experience of the living God. And that is the beauty of this program, that in everything is an encounter with the Lord who's healing people. And you put yourself in that, and it's just like watching miracles 2022 years ago. Like it's like being there. And that's why we have so many volunteers, because it's just breathtaking.
Yes.
It's miraculous, and we're privy front row. A lot of people say the same word. They all say front row to a miracle. And they want to keep coming because it's so compelling. And I also think that the group process is so beautiful, because Jesus always invited people to do something, like an action where because God will never violate our boundaries, especially with all the abuse. So it's really important in a program like this that people are invited. Nothing is forced on you. You don't have to do anything that you don't want to, but people are encouraged by others doing it and seeing how they're changing right before you, that they want a piece of the action. So in this blind Bartimaeus ritual, after they speak what they want, go to the next person, and then we pass around candles to everyone, and we pray that these candles would illuminate our, give us sight into those dark areas in our memory, the traumatic experiences that we haven't wanted to look at, that we've run away from, and that he would give us courage as we embark on this journey. So that's one of the first exercises. Then we have other ones like woman caught in adultery, where you're about to be stoned. Notice how the man gets off scot-free, but the woman carries the burden of all that shame. And but Jesus is there as she's about to be stoned, and he looks at her. So there's all these moments of encounter where he's looking at her eyes, and he's bent down, and he's writing on the ground. And we come up to people in the same way as we approach them for these exercises, the facilitators. We kneel down before them because we want our eyes to connect. If I'm standing above you, because where are your eyes when you're filled with shame? Everybody's down.
Right.
And it's also grounding to have that kind of eye contact. So there's a lot of things that are built into the retreat with the senses and the props and everything that are grounding materials to keep people from dissociating or shutting down, because this is a very trauma sensitive process. And then not having to talk about everything, although they share their story, but it's not the story of the abortion. It's the story of their life, so that they can identify what's made them vulnerable. And that can be so many things. Like if you hate your mother and you have a very tumultuous relationship, you don't want to take on that identity of a mother.
Right.
Because how are you like your mom? You have kids. I don't want kids. You know, all the histories of sexual abuse, the issues with father, issues with the church come up here. Like were you afraid to tell anybody? Like all that stuff. So there's many ways that previous trauma can be at play here. And we don't do this to take responsibility off anybody for their actions, because those actions need to be grieved and reconciled in the context of what is grief work. Grief work is reconciliation. I'm sorry to me. A lot of people believe that God can forgive them, but they can't forgive themselves.
Wow. Yes.
So we specialize in that.
That is beautiful. And something I think people may wonder too, okay, I had an abortion a year ago, 5 years ago, I'm having trouble in my marriage now. Okay, maybe this is something I need. But what if it was 30 years ago, 50 years ago? Talk about the time
Oh my
aspect.
gosh, we've had women come on our retreats who are close to 90. Some of them can't even hear. They're just so happy and they can't even say the word abortion. They've carried this their whole life. When I teach in hospitals, it's always the people in hospice who come up to me and say, oh my gosh, this is such an issue. Because people don't want to go into death if they have cancer. Or they don't want to go into death. They're terrified. Whereas their whole life, they might have felt like they were fine with it until they're on death's doorstep. So we have teams from Rachel's Vineyard going into hospitals to do very modified, shorter versions of like meeting the child. And we have a meditation where, you know, the Lord presents the child and everyone has a visceral experience of their child. They write letters to their baby that we read in a memorial service. We have bereavement dolls that they can carry around for a night before the thing. As they attach, they cover them with kisses. And this is being able to take action, because somatically, all this freeze of, I do not love you, I do not want you, is like a lie from the pit of hell. But they don't think they have the right to grieve because they chose this. So it's such a double bind, like, of not being so to be able to, it sounds kind of weird to have a little bereavement doll. They're faceless. I wish I had some pictures to show you. I would another time maybe. But just to be able to express that love, to be able to wrap them, hold them. Some women that had multiple abortions made buntings and carried their whole little family around. And to be able to show that love is so healing, because this is what returns feeling. And people say after the retreats that they had no idea that so much of their heart was shut down, because it's like a domino effect. You say to this child, I don't want you. You don't even realize the deadening, not only deadening of soul, but deadening of feeling, because that's the numbness of trauma, right? And that after the retreat, they were good mothers before, good mothers, they love their kids, but they had no idea there was so much of this love missing until the healing has filled that space. The grace has come in there. Other people talk about being in the shower and for the first time feeling the hot water on the back of their neck. So we're talking about coming back to your senses, as it were, where you can feel in that numbness that's so pervasive, or the fight or flight hyperarousal of PTSD, where you're always on the alert for threats of danger, where you don't feel safe to have your wanted children with a babysitter because you're afraid someone's going to hurt them. These are the ways that it comes out, or someone will come steal them if they're in a park. So there's all this kind of overprotectiveness for some people. Other people, it's the lack of attachment and bonding and shutdown.
Yeah. Oh, Dr. Burke, thank you so much, first of all, for letting God draw you into this ministry and just doing the work, and He's expanded it. We will make sure that links to Rachel's Vineyard are available under this video and in the show notes to the audio to this. And I know that there are people watching who have been living with this kind of grief for years. I know that just listening to this conversation, some have had awakening and healing, but I'm going to make sure that they get pointed to Rachel's Vineyard so that they can go through this experience. God bless you as you continue to do your work, and may it continue to expand.
Well, all wounds deserve to be cleansed, so don't be afraid if you're listening. It's a very gentle, very beautiful place for healing, and you'll meet friends that will sustain you on the journey, because it's very bonding to do this work together.
Yes. Amen, sister. God bless you.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. rachelsvineyard.org. You will see the link under this video. And if you or someone you care about has been affected by abortion, and I know there are those of you watching who have been, I am certain of it, then do check this out. I have friends. I referenced a couple of my personal experiences with people who are affected in this way in my conversation with Dr. Burke, but I have a significant number of friends who have experienced abortion themselves, who have been to a Rachel's Vineyard event, and their life has been transformed. That is not an overstatement. That is how they describe it. I referenced a friend of mine in this conversation who had had 3 abortions as a teenager, and when she did get married, was unable to experience sexual pleasure with her husband, and that marriage ended. She got married again, and it was still, difficult. She went through the Rachel's Vineyard experience, dealt with the grief of the pregnancy she had lost as a teenager, and her life changed. She told me, "I am now experiencing pleasure with my husband for the first time ever." That's just one small example. I have had women in my living room repeatedly who have told similar stories. This is a powerful program that works. rachelsvineyard.org. Check the link. You also heard Dr. Burke reference Grief to Grace, a healing program for those who have been through abuse, in particular sexual abuse, although a bit more broadly. We will also have the link to Grief to Grace under this video, grieftograce.org. I also have a friend who has been through that program. Highly, highly recommends it. I know her very well, know her personally. So check that out as well. For those, many of you watching who have experienced hurt, time itself does not heal all wounds. You heard Dr. Burke reference how individuals well up into their senior years who are still carrying this kind of hurt and grief can find healing. So just because it was a long time ago, if you have not done the work and grieved the process and found healing and reconciliation, do it now. It is not too late. Do it now. If I can be of any help, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment under this video. If you'd like to connect offline, you can use the contact page on drcarolministries.com. The Contact Us page there comes to me confidentially, and I respond personally. I would be honored to hear from you. I pray that God bless you. And until next time, go and live well.